So, hello everybody, it's Graham Canning here from People Centred Excellence, and I'm with my colleague Mike Denison. Mike's going to be running for us shortly, in the next few weeks, a new online programme that we've got called our Lean Leadership Development course. And in particular, this module looks at the role of leader. So I'm here today to ask Mike a few questions about that, and just to have a bit of a discussion about why the role of leader is such an important part of a lean transformation. So, hi, Mike.
Hi, good to see you again, Graham.
Mike, in your view, your experience, what's the role of the leader in an organisation driving towards a CI and Opex culture? Why is that so important?
Well, it is important on the first level because I think there's a lot of organisations that want to develop a structure that enables them to continuously improve, but with a way that engages their staff and their people on a day-by-day basis. So if you look at a continuous improvement organisation, one that's embedded, a culture of operational excellence, people every day are thinking about ways in which they can improve and develop and make their own roles and their processes better. And a lot of organisations are still struggling with this, even with the amount of tools and techniques that have been around for many, many years. And the leader has a big part to play in this. In my research and experience, what I've found is that leaders now need to consider themselves more as facilitators rather than experts. An expert leader might know how to solve problems in one particular way, but they won't know how to actually address some of the challenges that people have on a day-by-day basis. So I think a leader is more of a facilitator for growth. So okay. The idea that if you spend time growing your people, your people will grow the capability of the business. I can only really go back to my own experience in Toyota, working there in the 90s when we launched the UK operation. And one of the big statements that Toyota would often make is they build people before they build cars. And so they build people who are enabled to build quality cars. So a lot about the systems, a lot about the management processes, but a big part of it is a leader's role is to engage and facilitate the development of their people.
Okay, so can you give me a couple of examples of how that leadership behaviour might differ in a good lean or operationally excellent organisation compared to the more traditional leadership styles?
Okay, so the way I would see it is leaders have a responsibility for developing some of the systems that bring them in contact with people. So if you think about the way people manage their day-to-day activities, one is they're trying to organize and work in their processes that actually produce a product. And there's opportunities to actually improve that process continually. And they have problems every day that they need to be addressed. So there are 2 or 3 areas there. One is about how do you engage with your staff to think about, or your people to think about, what could they improve on a day-by-day basis? And how could they better solve problems on a day-by-day basis? And the third one is how are they performing on a day-by-day basis? So there's 3 examples of where a leader needs to consider the time and the place to engage with people so that they can influence how those people think. When they're talking about their processes and making improvements, I always think about the scientific method, utilizing, we talk about plan, do, check, act, but it's much more than that. It's much more of a scientific approach to how people structure the way that they make improvements. And leaders have a part to play in the way that they engage and ask questions and contribute to helping people to think more scientifically about what they do. You can apply the same in problem solving, and you can apply the same within how they're managing their performance, how they're measuring what they're actually doing. I mean, a lot of organizations still tend to measure what I call lagging measures, which, all right, they give you the results, but actually in a team, the leaders need to be encouraging people to focus much more on leading measures, what I call process metrics, the metrics that the team can actually influence hour by hour, day by day, so that when they make changes, they can see the impact of that. And that can be motivational for people.
It's much more dynamic, isn't it, than perhaps a traditional leadership style?
Absolutely. And traditionally, leaders would consider themselves that they've grown into a leadership position because they're experts in sometimes in the technical elements of it. But actually going forward, you think about COVID now, the challenges that this has created. No leader has a solution for this, you know, and yet you need to be able to give people a frame of reference by which they can organize, orientate, and navigate their way through some of these challenges that people are having, in a way which means that they can do it and sustain the improvements that they're putting in place. So I wouldn't be teaching people, you need to fix it this way. I'd be thinking about, well, what ways or what ideas do you have, and how can you do it in a way that you can measure step by step those improvements that you're making?
Yeah, it's much more supportive, isn't it? I mean, again, I can remember managers in my dim and distant past saying, "Don't bring me problems, you know, bring me solutions." And it's like, that probably isn't good enough. That's not what we mean.
I don't think it is anymore. It probably, well, it definitely did have it work at one time. One of the things that I often talk about when I'm helping leaders develop the way that they think is looking at the evolution of an organizational structure. Traditionally, you know, the models that happened in business, they were based on a military model. And if you go back 100 years, 150 years, most leadership came from within the military. So that they were taught to be command and control. And that model has stayed for a long, long time, probably too long, really. Even there's some organizations now who still think a command and control military style of leadership works. And it can in a certain type of environment. But I think for the modern day, it doesn't. That evolved then into what I call more of a functional organization, which meant that people were broken into functions. But there was a problem with that, because then you got some conflict that existed between functions, where one function was performing well, another one was not performing well. But of course, they would then fight with each other. But in reality, they should have been collaborating. And then we started to see matrix types organizations. And I think the one that we're moving into now is what I call an enabling organization, which comes on the back of a lot of total quality management thinking around turning the organization upside down, where the leader's role is to support and enable people to be successful in what they do. So creating the environment for people to succeed in. So creating the systems that support, but doesn't necessarily suck all the leader's time. I mean, he hasn't got to be on the shop floor 100% of the time, but he has to have a frame of reference which supports people in how they problem solve, in how they make improvements, in how they develop and improve performance. So it's a very, very different type of thinking way, and it's a very different type of organization from what we traditionally got used to.
Yeah, those structures and disciplines are probably ever more important, aren't they, in the current crisis that we're in at the minute, because actually a lot of people are working remotely.
Definitely.
So you still need to have those kind of systems that you can fall back on. Otherwise, you go to a situation where what's happening is out of control, and you don't have any kind of sense of people being able to actually step up. Or you know, a situation where you're running around like a headless chicken trying to keep on top of all this.
Do you know what? I think if you give people a level of autonomy, they will step up. But what you can't do is just leave them to it. You have to have an interface, which means that you are evaluating their maturity and their ability to grow as a person. So you have to stretch them. I think a leader has a responsibility to take somebody just outside of their comfort zone. So they have to stretch themselves. And if they're struggling a little bit, or they can't find their way forward with their own thoughts and the ideas of within the team, when the leader steps in and asks questions, he can then draw on that person's capability and the team's capability to find their own solutions. That's going to be much more beneficial than the leader coming in saying, no, what you need to do is this, this, and this. Even though that seems like the fastest way of doing it, in the long term, it doesn't produce the benefits. Yeah,
that's really fascinating. I know that in some of the course literature that we're pulling together, we talk a bit about the 5 key drivers.
Yeah.
Want to explain a little bit about what they are and how they help leaders sort of becoming more effective in the role that we've just talked about?
So I'll give a very, very brief overview of what they are and where they've sort of come from. And they've certainly come from my research and my experience over the last 20 odd years of delivering improvements and consultancy and coaching within organizations. If people want to know a bit more about the 5 drivers, obviously they need to come to the course, and we go into a lot of detail around how they work and how that helps a leader. But fundamentally what they're doing is they give the leader a framework for thinking differently from how they may have been taught to lead in the past. Traditionally, leadership was very much about, yes, setting a vision, managing your people, communicating really well, and leaders have a fairly good idea around that. So I haven't gone into the traditional things. I've made an assumption here that lots of leaders have learned those basics around that. What I have done is I've learned that these 5 drivers are really the drivers that help leaders become a leader who is trying to engage the people in their organization and build a culture which is delivering continuous improvement every day. So let me just explain what the drivers are. The first one is what we call direction. So the first driver is a leader has to set a clear, unambiguous direction about where the organization's going, how they want people to act and think, and also set a bit of a, maybe not target so much, but certainly ideas about what the people could be doing to take it forward. Not telling them what to do, but where they should be aiming for. So there should be no ambiguity in an organization. The leader's role is to align and engage the people across the organization and into the organization to all be going in the same direction. Now, we hear about that from Hoshin processes, and we hear about that from visioning, and there's lots of ways in which you can set a clear direction, but it's one of the first things I look at when I go in an organization. Is there a clear direction that's unambiguous and people in the organization understand it very, very clearly? The second driver is, am I as a leader demonstrating the types of behavior that I want my people to do? So we're talking about role model leadership here. So am I actually presenting a powerful shadow? Am I leading with a strong shadow about what I want people to do? So the things I prioritize, the things I focus in, the things I ask people to measure, all of those things are going to set a bit of an indicator about how I want people to behave in the organization. So the first thing I should be doing as a leader is behaving in a way that demonstrates how I want other people to behave. So there should be a set of leadership behaviors, even if there's 4 or 5 that are key, that help people to understand this is how leaders behave now. I mean, one of the key ones that we hear about is Gemba walks and going down to the Gemba and seeing the shop floor or go and see. That's a leadership behavior. You need to demonstrate that frequently. Another one is focusing on standards and not walking past standards and following up on standards. Those are what I call leadership behaviors, and they can be encompassed within the driver of demonstration. The third driver is development or developing, and there's 2 parts to that. There's developing myself as a leader to lead more effectively in a continuous improvement environment. So the type of things that I do, the questions that I ask, how I engage with people. And the second part of development is, how am I developing my people? Not by sending them away on a training course, although that can be one way in which people learn. But one of the most powerful learning methods is actually on the shop floor, actually on the job, doing the work. And so that's where leaders can help by actually leading more with questions, using questions to drive how people think, which can affect how people behave, and ultimately the results that they get can all come as a result of how the leaders ask questions and engage with people. The fourth driver is discovery. And I use the word discovery because it's part of the scientific method. People have been talking about PDCA for about 50, 60, 70 years, but I still don't think a lot of organizations fully understand it. And the scientific method encompasses fully, or PDCA encompasses fully the scientific method, which is looking at your work on a day-to-day basis as a science. So if you want to make improvements, you have to understand where you are now, where you want to be in the future, and you have to navigate your way through challenges and experiments. And leaders should encourage those experiments, because that gives the workforce autonomy to be able to navigate their way forward. That's another time and a place where the leader can engage and to ask questions. So discovery comes through scientific means, and that's a big part of the continuous improvement framework that we want leaders to pick up. The last one is delivery, or delivering results. Well, you'd say, of course, leaders have to deliver results. Well, hang on a second. Leaders don't actually deliver the results. It's the people who report to you who deliver the results. So as a leader, you have a role a responsibility for creating the environment that helps them deliver the results. A safe environment, an encouraging environment, an environment where people are not afraid to ask for help, an environment where people admit their mistakes, because that helps us get to the root cause of a problem. So the 5 drivers are starting with direction, moving into demonstration, then into development of myself as a leader and my people, discovery through the scientific method, and finally delivering results through my people by creating an environment which encourages them to be successful.
Fantastic. And as you say, hopefully that will whet people's appetite for finding out a little bit more about those things.
Well, I've been delivering this in organizations now for probably about 15 years, and certainly the last 10 years I've really formulated these 5 drivers, and it's got a frame of reference behind it. It's got a coaching program that sits behind it, and the organizations, and the several organizations who really took this to heart, they're really performing well as a result of it, and they're now starting to see consistent results, which before it was a little bit up and down and they were playing with various tools. But now what's starting to happen, people are starting to solve problems more effectively. They're starting to put improvements in place that are starting to have the impact that they were hoping it would have.
Yeah, I really like the link to the scientific method as well. Obviously, we're talking a lot about Toyota Kata, some of the other courses that we're running, and also something that I read just the other day about mastery of the basics. You know, a lot of people, they skim over these things and they don't really have a very deep understanding of their own processes. And actually, it's by having that and really learning about that, taking the time to learn that, that you really understand the profound nature of your own processes and where those actual root causes tend to be.
Absolutely. I mean, I come from a background where there's no such thing as failure. You know, if failure doesn't really exist, if something hasn't worked, you either haven't understood it at the time or you've made a mistake, and there's learning that can happen from that. So to me, if you're going to talk about failure, failure happens when you give up on something. Failure doesn't happen when you move forward and you know accelerate and pull back and have to find new ways of doing things. I think leaders need to encourage people not to fail, but certainly to practice and experiment with things so that they can learn faster.
And that framework of psychological safety is also an important role for a leader as well, isn't it? You know, to become a learning organization, leaders need to not make sure that those people don't fear failure, but the consequences of failure is that you learn something, not that actually you're going to get punished somehow or scapegoated. If
people are afraid of failure, if people are afraid of making mistakes, if people are afraid of the bad results of an experiment, then they'll hide things, which means you never get to the root cause. Yes. And it's not only that, it creates an environment of tension or stress. I'll use stress rather than tension, which actually is not healthy in an organization. You know, a level of tension which creates stimulation to motivate people to move towards something that maybe seems a little bit unattainable, but you give them the autonomy to move forward towards it, people will do it. And it's surprising how people step up to the plate. I've seen examples in a couple of organizations I've worked in recently where the whole COVID situation meant that the leaders had to let go much more than they ever have done before. And they are overwhelmed by how quick the team leaders and the supervisors and the managers, the junior managers, have stepped up to the plate, because they're the ones who are in the plants at the moment, while some of the senior leaders are talking to them over the phone from their home, and they're letting it go. And it's amazing how people will step up if you give them the support and the structure and the tension to drive them. I think it definitely works.
There's an awful lot of latent potential there, isn't there? In most organizations stays latent because it just isn't drawn out of people in the right way. Or they're spending lots of energy covering things up because they know the consequences of error, and that energy, it could be better diverted to making more positive improvement.
Most certainly.
I've got another question for you.
Go on.
We've walked into many different businesses over the years as consultants and as managers. When you go into an organization for the first time and you start measuring up continuous improvement or Opex culture, what does that look like to you? What kind of things do you look out for? And how do you know what's good when you see it?
Okay, it's an interesting question. It's a very good question. Sometimes it can be quite challenging to explain that. I sometimes feel like I have a smell for it. You can just smell whether it exists in this particular organization. But there are a few signs that you can see. Generally, yes, you can see a tidy organization, and that is an indicator sometimes of the way things are. But I tend to look for the telltale signs of how teams are operating. I will more than likely not look at the leadership group. I will go and see how the teams are performing, and I will spend time trying to understand what are they doing, how are they operating, are they using more of a scientific approach? And then I'm watching and observing how the leaders interface with those people, how they engage with people. And so that the way a leader engages leaves a very clear message as to whether people feel psychologically safe. But not only that, they also feel inspired or instilled to want to do something more. So the type of questions that leaders ask can often be a real clue. And it's fascinating. Gallup did do a number of surveys every 2 or 3 years, and the last one came out in 2019. And what they said there was 85% of employees are either disengaged, okay, or not fully engaged, or 35% of those are actively disengaged. And that's quite frightening. So for me, a big telltale sign that I've got a continuous improvement culture is how engaged people are in what they're doing every day, what they're thinking about, engaged with having ideas, drawing on those ideas, working on those ideas, experimenting, and how the leaders support it. The other thing I tend to look for actually is a really powerful and-on. The idea of an and-on being a tool by which people can call for help, but also identify the problems that they're having so we can get problem solving happening very quickly. And I'm not just looking for the lights, the red, yellows, and greens. I'm not just looking for the numbers. I'm looking for a mature and-on that shows me that people are very willing not to stop the line, but to call for help. You know, look, stopping the line might be part of that, but call for help. Because when they call for help, it tells me that there's a fast response there. And if there's a fast response, we're looking and trying to understand the root cause of a problem. That tells me that the leaders and the team leaders and the managers are engaged with the workforce to want to help them improve. So that's usually a good indicator for me. And then the other thing I'll look for is I'll show me how you've gone through a couple of problems that you've worked through. And if I can see the scientific method in their thinking, whether it's through a chart or wall information, or whether it's on an A3 report, that is an indicator to me that there's maturity in that organization.
Yeah, absolutely. And it is in the air, isn't it? You get a buzz when you see those things. You can start feeling there's an energy somehow in those places that you don't get elsewhere. But, you know, when you walk into it, it has a very flat feel to it. The people are just
you can tell when people are putting what I call discretionary effort in to things. You know, if you've got an engaged workforce, if you've got businesses that have orientated themselves towards performance management systems, which fundamentally work around the basic human needs for psychological engagement and psychological safety, then those employees will often put much more in. They'll go the extra mile. They'll put discretionary effort in because they feel valued, because they feel appreciated, because they feel cared for. So they will put effort in on that. And it's obvious, you know, you can see the way that teams operate around that, how they're managing particular situations and problems.
Yeah. Sometimes the very nature of work means it can't be that meaningful, but what you can give people in return is actually some meaningful involvement in improvement.
Yeah.
People are spending an awful long time in work, you know, in their lives. And wouldn't it be better for everybody, really? And this comes down to this kind of respect for humanity thing that Toyota talk about, isn't it? Yeah. Actually giving people, you know, some value, some meaningful work to do, even if the task itself is a bit mundane. Actually get involved in improvement activity and you know, mentally sort of contribute and stimulate some of that improvement activity.
And that is the leader's role. That to me is what it's all about. I mean, people talk about lean and continuous improvement, and they say, you know, oh, it's not about the tools, we've understood that, but you know, well, it's all about leadership. Well, it's not just about leadership. It's about leadership recognizing that they have a part to play in enabling a continuous improvement culture and creating an environment for people to succeed in. When you create that environment, then people will perform.
Yes, I think you're right. I mean, I think again, intentional leadership, you know, so that's leadership with the strong intent to actually provide those kind of conditions. And it might take time. It's not going to be something that happens overnight. If you were to go into an organization that wanted to know about how to set up things like some daily continuous improvement activity, what would be a couple of starter tips that you would give them to do?
Yeah, but I do get asked this quite a lot, actually. And I always think to myself, in order to understand what's going on and the problems that you've got to understand how the teams are performing. So one of the first elements I will often look at, I don't tend to go into organizations and start looking at value stream maps and implementing 5S and those type of things, because I think they give you an indicator, but I actually want to know what the real problems are within the teams. So I will often start off by introducing a level of visual performance management so that the teams can understand against certain metrics how they're actually performing on a day-by-day basis. Not just the teams, but the teams in the area. And if you can tier that up so that you can have tiered performance management, you can see how the cascade of the objectives come down from the senior management into the teams, but also how the team's performance cascades up into showing how the output metrics that we need to deliver to the customer and the schedules and everything else, how they're being delivered at a team level. So I'm looking for process metrics, what I call leading metrics at a team level. Once we get that and we can start to see the level of problems that are happening, we can then teach the teams how to better problem solving using the scientific method. When you approach it in that way, then they start to knock off some of those problems. When you start to knock off the problems, you can then start to apply standardization in the areas where they had problems before, which prevents the problem from reoccurring. So now you can reinforce standardization. And once you have standardization, now you can start to introduce continuous improvement based on the frame of reference that you've got, the baseline that you've got, something to build upon. So now I've got a meaningful way in which teams can build a structure for daily continuous improvement, starting with visual performance management, working on problem solving, putting standards in place. Now I can start to do it. I could just start with continuous improvement from the standards that companies have, but they've got to have good standards to start off with, and very often they don't have it. So I start by getting the visual performance, then looking at problems, and then build it from that. So it sort of expands out generally.
So people listening to this or watching little bits of this on YouTube or whatever might be thinking, is this for me? What kind of leaders would get most out of this training? Who are we appealing to most?
Well, the first thing I would always advise is, if you're seriously considering this in your organization, the more senior leaders should go through this first so that they understand the context. So the more senior you are, the more likely is you will understand how this starts to fit together. And you'll probably even have some insights as to the gaps that exist in your own organization. So if I'm going into an organization completely blind, I would be guiding the senior leaders to pick up on the signs here first. Sometimes that can be quite difficult, because when you're doing on-site training and things like that, or on-site development, getting those senior leaders time can be quite challenging. But because we're doing it online now, 2 hours every week can be a really insightful way of getting an insight into this approach and this process. And then you can start to build it around that. However, it's not just senior leaders who get benefit. Middle managers can get benefit from it because they'll see the context of it. Even team leaders can get an understanding. The difficulty, though, is if you come on it as a team leader and your senior manager doesn't understand where you're looking on this, you could actually spend time developing the right knowledge around how to lead, but then be contradicted by your own organization. So have a think about it. What I would say is, if you're considering it, look at the senior leaders first, then rotate it down or bring it down to a lower level of the organization, and we can build it in there. The other people who get a lot of benefit from this, actually, and this is sometimes where I start in organizations, are the continuous improvement managers, so that they can really understand how to actually shift and change what needs to be changed in their organization. Very often they've gone through the training with me and my organization, and what they've done is they've gone back and said, you know what, we need to pick up on some of this, because this is what's missing in our organization. If we're truly going to call ourselves a lean or a continuous improvement type organization who wants to sustain the improvements and engage our staff and our workforce in what they're doing. So the levels, really, any level of leadership will get benefit, but I would always maybe encourage towards the seniors first. And then the continuous improvement managers and the change agents in the organization will get lots of benefit from it.
I mean, they can often be the catalyst, can't they, to actually bring the leadership on board, if they've got some of the understanding of that. And I think of a few examples where organizations have got to a bit of a plateau with perhaps a more tools-led implementation of lean, and really need to start bringing some of the leadership behaviors on board to really get more bang for their buck out of their lean programs. And so a CI lead would be very influential on that in terms of making sure that the leader actually supports some of the.
In fact, I'd even go so far as, sorry, I'm cutting you off a bit there, Graham.
Okay.
I'd even go so far as to say that if you have been a tools-led organization in the past and you're now working towards putting a stronger leadership structure, you've probably already started by putting some of these things in place along, because I think this will close a few of those gaps for you, and we can have some conversations around how you can actually move that forward in your own organization. Once you get an insight into this and how it fits together, you can then start to build a pattern of learning that will take the leaders in your organization forward.
Fantastic. So folks, if you're interested in finding out more, we'll put the link on our website to this course and at the end of this video. So if you go to www.peoplecenteredexcellence.co.uk, you'll find out more details of it on the website there, or drop Mike or myself a note on an email, or drop us a note on LinkedIn, and we'll happily come and talk to you in a bit more detail about the suitability of this course for you. Starts the end of October, runs weekly for 8 weeks, is it, Mike?
Yeah.
So we really hope that many of you will come and join Mike and I on that training. Thanks again for your time, Mike.
Absolutely, it's great pleasure talking to you and about the whole process.
We could talk all day, I know, and I'm sure we will.
Yeah.
Well, thanks for now, and thanks to everybody for listening. Take care. Bye-bye.
Take care. Goodbye. See you all.